First, starting off, this is Tom MacMillan, a socialist historian and activist from Maine, currently studying in Montreal, Quebec, and Canada. First, how is the volume? Can you hear things okay?
Yes, I think that it just kind of went back and forth, like it went on and off for a second, but I
Okay,
think I can hear you fine now.
the volume is good. Okay, great. How is Quebec, and Montreal dealing with quarantine? Like this is April, was it April 17th? Forget the date.
19.
19th, yeah, I've been out of it. It's April 19th.
Yep.
We're quite a ways, a couple of weeks into the pandemic. And where I am, most of the U.S. is lockdown, not lockdown, but shut down, quarantined. How is the situation? What is the situation in Montreal and Quebec?
So Quebec is the hotbed of Canada for
Okay,
COVID-19,
all right.
and Montreal is the hotbed of Quebec. So Montreal is the most infected place in Canada.
Okay, well,
Uh, yeah, so I'm in the middle of the pandemic here.
yeah,
Um, you know, they were much better prepared and they implemented restrictions much earlier than most other places like New
right,
York or Florida, where we're seeing um, social breakdown, basically,
right,
and the collapse of society in certain ways.
right,
Nothing
right.
like that is happening here. There's
Okay,
no calls to liberate Quebec.
yeah. Yeah,
As
that we have this here in the U.S. Like it's like the Tea Party movement again. They call it the Boogaloos. It's AstroTurf, but New Hampshire group in New Hampshire called the Boogaloos. That's what they're calling themselves. Apparently, AstroTurf right wing movement, like the Tea Party movement a couple of years ago. Same type of thing.
Yeah. And actually, that type of movement is actually what helped inspire me to write my thesis, which we're going to talk about today. So,
Okay. Okay. Interesting.
and I see a lot of parallels between sort of astroturf groups of the Tea Party and this whatever this is now, and the Ku Klux Klan and the Know Nothings of yesterday.
Right. Right.
So,
Mid 20th century version of that. Right.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Interesting.
But Montreal, up here, the institutions are still working. The only one that's really falling apart are the senior homes.
Okay.
There's really big infections there and a
Right.
lot of deaths, and that's where most of the deaths are from.
Right.
Um, and I think there was like 7,000 in Montreal in confirmed cases.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, it's a big deal, but people are managing. And there was a recent analytics survey from Google that said Quebec was doing the best of any province of social distancing.
That's good.
Um, yeah, it happened here primarily because of bad timing. There was spring break for a lot of universities
Right.
right before the pandemic hit. So a
Right.
lot of them went to like Florida and stuff and places like that
Oh
and
yeah.
brought it home with them.
Right.
Um,
Right.
Back when it wasn't known that it would be such a big deal. Um,
Right. Right.
yeah. Um, so, um, it's still startling to be in a big city and have it be so quiet.
Yeah.
A city like Montreal, 1.5 million people in a metro area of like 3 or 4 million people. It's very quiet right now, and it's kind of pleasant
Yeah. Yeah.
in some ways. We still have income for the moment, my partner and I, and we we're managing, and no small kids either. So we're
Yeah.
pretty lucky compared to a lot of people.
Yeah. Is there a sign of flattening the curve flattening where you are, or is it still increasing? Or
It's flattened.
okay.
They predicted really terrible things at the beginning. Even best case scenarios were pretty terrible, and they've surpassed that. I mean, they've flattened the curve more than they expected.
That's good.
And so yeah, they're talking about. There was some talk. Quebec does have a right wing sort of cultural nationalist
Yeah.
leader.
Right.
and he has talked about, opening things up again, schools even,
Mm.
and people are very angry about that, and there's a lot of pressure against that sort of stuff. So, I think for the meantime, for the next couple months, I expect it to stay basically the same.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, yeah, there's movement in the U.S. to open things up. Trump and even some Democrats like Cuomo and Biden are kind of hinting at it. But yeah. Okay, to change the subject slightly. And I know I've asked this last time, but if you could share a little bit about what got you involved in the left or moved you to left-wing politics or
Sure.
left-wing critique of capitalism.
Well, I grew up in a working class family. My father was a auto mechanic who was also an alcoholic, and my mom was a medical technician for a hospital.
Right.
And um, I grew up pretty poor, but not really politically minded, or there wasn't really nobody on either side of my family is on the left, I would say, or they weren't. No, still today, nobody else is really
Yeah.
on the left.
Yeah.
But I was exposed to ideas of anti-imperialism first as a teenager, and peace building at Seeds of Peace camp
Mhm.
in Maine, meeting people from India and Pakistan and the Balkans and and this is in the early 2000s, and the Middle East, Israel and Palestine and such, during really, really hot conflicts. And I learned firsthand from them, like what was the U.S. doing in their countries, and what was my role in it as an American. I also lived through 9/11 as a teenager,
Right.
went through the Iraq War as a teenager, and really saw the U.S. government, as a illegitimate force in the world that was really wreaking havoc. So it's kind of hard not to be on the left if those were some
Yeah.
of your touchstone experiences.
Yeah.
Uh, but I also, uh, I was thinking, I have a very distinct memory of being in seventh grade and being interviewed for Seeds of Peace to go to it to represent a Maine delegation,
Okay.
and they asked me, what do you think is the biggest problem in your school? And I said, well, the rich kids are really mean to us, and I really don't like the rich kids very much. So I think I
Right.
had I think I had sort of and this was
So,
always going to be the trajectory that I was going to take in
yeah.
one way or another.
Right. I love it.
And so I went to school, college, and I started a, Palestinian solidarity group at a very Zionist school in Massachusetts.
Okay.
Um, and But I think what really prompted me to get involved, rather than just to have ideas and to have a critique, to become an activist, was my mother, who wasn't politically active. She worked for Maine Medical Center, the biggest employer in Maine, or in southern Maine. And for 23 years, from the time before I was born until the day she died, she worked for Maine Medical Center. And at the end of her life, she had pancreatic cancer, and her employer was going to kick her off of her health insurance after
Good.
23 years of working for a hospital.
Yeah. That's,
And I'll never forget when the HR person said, we're really sorry, but on April 1st, you're not going to have health insurance anymore. And you're not going to have an income, because she had been able to piece it together to keep an income
yeah.
while out on sick leave. And after, just the cruelty of capitalism and the inhumanity of it all really pushed me to step up and get involved, rather than just to sit on the sidelines.
Right. Right. And you went to the Middle East, and you also lived in or visited Namibia.
Yeah, I spent a summer in Egypt. Right after I graduated high school, I went to Egypt, and I volunteered teaching English at a school for South Sudanese refugees in
Okay.
Cairo.
Okay. Wow.
And I went to Israel for the first time. I've been to Israel twice. I was strip searched
Yeah.
in Egypt before I even got into Israel, as a threat, an
Whoa.
18-year-old threat to Israel, apparently. And you know, I went back again 2 years later, or no, 5 years later, and spent a summer with a Palestinian organization inside of Israel.
Okay.
That's on the left inside of Israel, called Baladna, and they and I did solidarity work and helped the organization. And I also, I spent a semester studying abroad in Namibia and South Africa. So I think my worldview at a very young age was very internationally oriented. I never imagined that I was going to be living in, Maine, which I did for, 7 years after, I moved back. But sort of the experience, the radicalization of seeing the harm the U.S. does abroad and seeing that I could play some role in challenging it at home, brought me back, basically.
Right. Cool. Okay, changing the subject slightly. Your career as an activist in Portland. You came back to the U.S. You were involved in marijuana legalization campaign. You were in the Green Party. You ran for mayor of Portland as a Green socialist.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I ran actually for office technically 3 times. I ran for state legislature twice.
okay.
And the second time I ran, I got 27% the first time I ran in a 3-way race.
Okay.
And I beat the Republican by doubling him up. So that's always good.
Right.
And the second time I ran, I felt really positive and I thought I could win. And then my landlord evicted me. And I couldn't find a new place to live in the district. It was right as Portland was starting to become a gentrification hotspot. And I had to withdraw from the race. At the same time, there was a massive fire that killed, I think, like 6 or 7 young renters.
Yeah.
I think it was around Halloween. And, that spurred a need for tenant activism and an opening for tenant activism in the city. And I helped to reform the Portland Tenants Union, which I felt was some of the best work that I did as an activist in Portland. It kind of got hijacked by opportunists, many of whom weren't even renters.
Right.
And it's no longer active as far as I know. But we did a lot of good work with tenant defense and pressuring the city to inspect housing and things like that to make it safer, as safe as it can be under capitalism.
Right. Right.
And we also passed the first ever marijuana legalization ordinance. And Portland became the first city in the U.S. in the East Coast to make marijuana legal, technically, under the boundaries of the city. Right. We also helped stop the privatization of public parks and undeveloped land in the city, which I was also very proud of doing. And we also helped. We also ran an initiative for $15 an hour minimum wage.
Right, I was involved in that.
Yeah, and you were involved with that, and it was kind of in part inspired by the work that you were doing at the time and was going on in Seattle and SeaTac and elsewhere, which unfortunately was not successful. We never got the backing that we thought we would from groups that officially supported $15 an hour, but weren't willing to challenge big businesses to make it happen.
Yeah, and this one group lowballed it somewhat, which is
labor organizing groups and liberal groups pressure progressive groups, those type of things. They wouldn't share resources. They wouldn't put any volunteer hours behind it or really do anything. So an issue that we could have won, outspent 100 to 1. Right. And and so then I ended up going back to graduate school after about 6 years of very nonstop. Like I needed to get back to researching as another form of activism, and so I went to the University of Maine in Orono, and
okay, cool. And what year did you run for mayor of Portland?
I ran in 2015.
Okay.
So that was the second mayoral election since 1923.
Right. Right.
Because the position was eliminated in 1923.
Right.
And it was brought back in 2011. That was the first one. And I volunteered for a candidate during that election. Probably the leftmost candidate at the time in the Green Party. And he finished fourth out of 15 candidates.
Mm-hmm.
And then I ran again myself in 4 years later.
Right. That's too bad. So you're independent right now? You're not in an organization?
Yeah, I'm not in any political party. I think we need to in the U.S. left, and especially, there needs to be sort of a regroupment. People need to come together and figure out how to bridge the gaps that are preventing sort of the real socialist left from having major political influence and social and not just as an electoral organization, but as a political force overall.
Right.
Especially with the potential of another depression, evictions. Yeah. There's a real need for people to to get over themselves and the sectarianism that sort of dominates the left, and figure out how to work together, and put some of the past behind us.
Right. Yeah, get over sectarianism, keep political independence of the working class, but get over sectarianism.
Right, absolutely.
United front from below.
Yeah, no, there's no room for compromise with the Democrats, but also there's room for compromising with people on who disagree in good faith with each other.
Right, makes sense. Interesting. Okay, now to change the subject again slightly. About your work in Portland, Maine. Last time you talked about history of class struggle in Portland. Of course, Portland, Maine, it's largest town in southern coastal Maine. Not Portland, Oregon, but Portland, Maine. Population of about 70,000. Is that accurate?
Yep.
It's primarily a blue-collar working class city with a large artsy hip element grafted onto it. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, at one time. I think the city has been even more gentrified now to say that it's mostly a retirement community and a vacation town for the rich.
Yeah. Right.
The working class has been mostly pushed out at this point.
Right.
But yeah, I would say 20 years ago that was probably a good description.
Right. It's ethnically fairly diverse. You have Yankees. You get Maine is a federal refugee settlement area, so Somali people, large Iraqi community.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you talked about class struggle starting in the 1840s or so, before the Civil War, Irish dock workers.
Yeah. So my thesis, which is available online if anybody wants to read it, through my.
What's it called?
So the title is a real political and a real quote political and social revolution: nativism, class conflict, and urban reform in Portland, Maine, 1840 to 1923.
Okay, well,
that's a long title.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I kind of I started this project thinking about the wanting to focus on the Ku Klux Klan. Right. And the creation of the city manager system in Portland. My project started as an analysis of the city manager system and the Ku Klux Klan in Portland, Maine, which they worked together in 1923 to eliminate basically democratic government from the city.
Right.
And that's sort of where my story culminates in. But I realized there wasn't enough of to tell the story. I needed to look back further. And as I looked back further and further, I kept seeing all these parallels in the history of Portland, and seeing periods of intense class conflict followed by periods of intense nativism. And I wanted to, expand the story, so it expanded much further than I ever expected it would, to talk about different periods of class conflict and how nativism was sort of weaponized to prevent the working class from working together, to put one worker against another.
Right.
So my story begins in the 1840s, and I look at with the arrival of Irish Americans or Irish immigrants moving to Portland, and how this helped spurred, along with industrialization, the first wave of industrialization spurred a period of intense conflict between bosses and workers. And this was very much a multi-ethnic conflict, but including both native-born and Irish workers, as well as an entirely native-born English-speaking, capitalist class. And so, moving forward, I looked at what was the result of this conflict. So things like laws to prevent workers from working too many hours were passed at the state legislative level. But then elites, they used, they inspire a lot of nativism against Irish workers. And anytime large numbers of new groups move into a community, naturally people are going to be somewhat skeptical or somewhat unsure, just because change is hard. And people were already leading very difficult lives, working class people. Right. And the response to this sort of newness and the threats from below, from the Irish working class and the Yankee working class working together, was in Maine to inspire the temperance movement. Portland is the hub, or Portland is the birthplace of temperance, of political prohibition of alcohol. Right. And in the early 1850s, the mayor, Neil Dow, he was the father of prohibition, and also a capitalist. He owned a large tannery. Right. And the city workers were not very happy about being denied alcohol. Right. And so they protested when they found out that he had bottles of rum. He had not bottles. He had barrels of rum inside of City Hall. So workers showed up, thousands of workers and regular residents showed up to protest against this. And he hired Dow, the mayor. He tried to get the regular police force to shoot the protesters, and they wouldn't. So he used sort of his special militia that he had hired out of the skilled working class primarily to attack the workers. And he actually killed one of the workers who was protesting. Okay. And this was a very, very famous story that anybody who studies mid-19th century U.S. history may have heard of. But what I think my contribution was that, to look at it through the lens of class, and to not just say, oh, it was a bunch of drunk workers who wanted their alcohol, but to look at how, the nativism is used to divide working class people, right, and to inspire violence, class violence.
Right. And prohibition was a way of policing the working class, disciplining the working class.
Right. Exactly. And also, the prohibition was more popular with native-born workers than it was with foreign-born
Right.
workers. So it was a way to split them as well.
Right. It's a stereotype that Irish and German immigrants like to drink. They like beer.
Right. Of course, at this time period, alcohol was more safer than water to drink.
Yeah.
So everybody drank at this,
Yeah.
including the mayor who wanted to ban it.
Right. Right.
So, um, so I sort of go through and I sort of look at this sort of conflict in my first section. And going also looking at like the growth of Irish nationalism. Portland always had a very strong Irish nationalist presence.
Okay. Okay.
And the Greenback movement. So through the Civil War up to the 1880s, sort of looking at all these instances of nativism and class conflict that went on together. And my second section, it's focusing on progressivism
Okay.
and the necessity of reform for the ruling class to be able to maintain power, during a period when there were really for the first time mass immigration. And, the elites sort of felt threatened by immigrants, many of whom had very radical political beliefs, and who were also heavily exploited in the city's manufacturing industries, and so they were the city government responded in a variety of ways to this sort of conflict. They changed the city, like they prohibited large industrial scale businesses from opening in the city.
Okay. Okay.
So because they thought that steel workers and immigrants from Eastern Europe who might fill these sort of jobs were dangerous and dirty. That was their way of thinking, and so they created sort of a city beautiful,
Okay.
which Portland, if anyone who hasn't ever been there who might be listening, Portland is an incredibly beautiful city.
Yeah.
Surrounded by water. It has large parks and very beautiful old homes. And this was sort of designed by the element of the wealthy, of the capitalist class, to be a city that could attract rich people to move there, rather than a city which would attract immigrants and large numbers of working class, as Boston and elsewhere had.
Right.
Lynn, New Bedford,
Right.
sort of these industrial cities to the south in Massachusetts or New Hampshire. They didn't want that, so they sort of invested in items that would make that less likely to happen.
Right.
And so I go through again the themes of class conflict and nativism, looking at new unions, and when Eugene Debs came to visit Portland as a labor hero, and looking at Irish dock workers who organized an independent union, the rise of a socialist party that helped pass laws like to socialize the water industry, and to have to create the Portland Water District, which would be publicly owned utilities. And Portland was not Milwaukee. It was never a city run by working class people, but workers definitely, and radical workers in the Socialist Party, had a large influence, especially in the early 1900s.
Right.
And yes,
Socialist Party did it hold office in Portland or in Maine, but it had some influence.
It did hold office in some parts of Maine. There was also branches of the Socialist Labor Party.
Okay, yes,
the SLP, and but in Portland, it never held office. Office holding during this time period was very, very corrupt. There was very Democrat. You can't really say that the U.S. had democratic elections during this time period, because vote rigging was very, very common.
It still is, but it's more.
And it's still, things don't change that much. all, or at least very quickly. So Portlanders never elected a socialist, though the socialists consistently did run for office. But they did have a large influence.
Okay. Okay.
And I think one of the culminating influences of this was the 1916 trolley workers strike, of which there's a really great article published in the Labor History Journal to talk about this.
Okay. Okay.
And in this strike, in the middle of summer, Portland, as a tourist destination, was overrun with tourists in the summer. Again, things don't change.
Yeah.
And the trolley workers, who were the primary, who ran the trains that allowed people to commute long distances into the city, or to get to their camps out in the woods, or to go to the islands, or those big hotels that they had, decided to strike against a very large Wall Street-owned company that employed them. And in 1916, they won. The workers were very, very popular. People boycotted the trolleys rather than support them while the workers were on strike. There was large protests every night in public, and the owners blamed the trolley. They blamed not the trolley workers themselves necessarily for winning, but they blamed the socialists, and they blamed the city government, which had a number of non-businessmen on it, men who were skilled workers and such.
Right. Quote, outside agitators. That's what they
always the outside agitators. Yes.
Yeah.
So these socialists, these Jewish community leaders, Irish community leaders, they were not willing to shoot the strikers, to use force against them, even though the mayor wanted to, or the mayor had deputized lots and lots of workers, out-of-employed shoe workers, actually, to fight the trolley workers,
right.
as city police.
One working class against another. Yeah.
Exactly. But he couldn't do it because there was too much popular pressure in favor of the trolley workers, and eventually they struck. After striking, eventually they won.
Okay.
And so in 1916, right as the U.S. is about to enter World War I, the workers of Portland were never more powerful. That's my argument. And so the World War I changed that. It changed that all over the country. It really shifted the internal calculus against the working class.
Right.
So World War I, most people know, was a period of intense patriotism, xenophobia, and jingoism, and the Portland, as a city connected by rail to Montreal. I wish I could take a train to Portland today, but back then you could. Through the mountains and into Montreal, from Portland to Montreal. But Portland was very, very dependent on Canadian trade as the winter port of Canada, basically. Mass amounts of goods every winter, every fall and winter, would be sent through Portland to Europe. So there were major ships transporting goods from Portland to Liverpool, and to England, especially, from Canada and the U.S. And so Portland sort of became this intensely patriotic city, and the Socialist Party stops running for office. There's threats of vigilante violence against pacifists. There's a story of a preacher, of a leader of a church, who is hung in effigy in downtown Portland for opposing World War I, U.S. involvement in World War I.
Yes.
And so this is, the ideal time period for a crackdown on democracy. and the city business community, which had just lost a major strike, used World War I and this intense patriotism and crackdown on dissent to change the calculus of the city and to go on the offensive.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1918, the city Chamber of Commerce began to look at changing the city government. And they searched all around the country for what would be the system that they'd rather have. And they decided on what was called the council manager system, or the city manager system. The system that they chose was the most reactionary system in the country. It had been kind of the go-to for cities that had faced intense class conflict. They turned to it. So the clearest example of this is in Dayton, Ohio, which was a major, not a major, but a large industrial production center.
Right.
And they had a large socialist party that was much larger than anything in Portland. But they had won a number of offices in city government and looked like they were heading for a socialist government, a socialist-run government, city government, just like Milwaukee, which had been, had been a hub of socialism for decades, even at that point. And so in Dayton, Ohio, they turned to the system, and they were able to convince just enough people to adopt a city manager system.
Right.
And what this city manager system does, it shrinks the number of people who are elected to office. City governments during the 19th century were often very large and included people who were just regular members of the community rather than sort of like professional politicians.
Right.
And what they wanted to do was to shrink the number of people in city government to a manageable number. In Portland's case, ended up being 5 for the whole city.
Right.
And make elections, the whole city voting on those candidates rather than by neighborhood or district.
Right. Right.
And hand over the power, just like and turn basically the city council into a board of directors, and the city manager to be the CEO.
Like a corporation.
Like exactly like a corporation. So this was the definition of running government like a business.
Yeah, exactly. Literally. Yeah.
Literally. And they were very conscious of this. They talked about this, that you wouldn't allow everyone to have input into the running of a corporation, just like you shouldn't let everyone have total input into running a city government.
Right. Right. How many council people men were there in Portland before this change?
So Portland had 2 bodies. There was an upper it was bicameral. So there was sort of a board of aldermen, which was 9 members. And then there was a common council, which had 27 members.
Okay. It was common for working class people to be in it, or socialist.
Yes. Yes. It was very common for the parties nominated candidates. So this was a time of intense patronage where you would get elected and pay someone to, hey, can I get my cousin on the fire department, that sort of thing.
Right.
And so socialists never served in Portland city government, but they did. Many workers served in city government, as well as members of ethnic communities, Jewish and Irish.
Okay.
So, in fact, right before the strike in 1916, almost half of the Common Council was made up of workers.
Right. Right.
Who weren't necessarily super radical. They weren't socialists, but they were nonetheless members of the working class and were hesitant to shoot up the previously mentioned strike.
Right, right.
So, moving forward, Dayton, Ohio, it works. They shut out socialists from city government. Government is saved from socialism.
Right.
And Portland City Council or Portland Chamber of Commerce says, yeah, this is the system we want.
Yeah.
And they begin moving forward on a plan to change the city government. In 1921, they get the state government to allow them to have an initiative to change the government. And it fails. It's very, very tightly divided between people who want to maintain the old system, people who want to change it a little bit, and people who want this new corporate style system.
Okay.
And the business community is very disappointed by this, but they don't give up. You can count on them to always continue moving forward. And 2 years later, which was the soonest they could do it again, they passed an initiative. They got the state government to allow them to have a vote and change government again. And it was basically the same charter, the same city constitution, regardless of who, So basically, they're just like, we'll do it again. Yeah. So at the same time period, the Ku Klux Klan organizes a chapter in Maine, in Portland. Right. And among sort of radical members of the Freemasonry and other fraternal organizations, sort of the more politically minded radical right-wingers, Protestant nationalists, and businessmen, they organize a chapter in Portland.
Okay.
And these two things are happening at the same time, right? There's this movement to implement a corporate style system and the Ku Klux Klan. And Portland, the Ku Klux Klan jumps on board with the Chamber of Commerce's movement for this new style city government. They say, this is great. We're going to jump on board and support this. Why? Because there's no more Irish people in city government. Yeah. There's no more Irish cops, they think, no more Irish teachers. Right. They're very explicit about this.
Right.
And Portland elites had tried previous times to sort of implement these new forms of city government that would put more control into fewer hands. And they had failed each time.
Okay.
And they had done so because people really weren't interested in it. People just didn't vote, and those who voted against it. Yeah. And they could never convince enough even native-born workers to support this.
Right. Mm.
So the Ku Klux Klan, as it does through its outrageous rhetoric, sort of transforms the 1923 election from a contest over tax rates and municipal governmental structures, which are boring to most people, and they're not really interested in city government most of the time.
Yeah.
They turn it into a contest between Protestants and Catholics.
Right.
Right? Between Americans and radicals.
Yeah.
Right? And this excites people.
Uh-huh.
And Portlanders turned out to vote in greater numbers than ever before. In 1923. More Portlanders came out to vote than ever in any city election prior to that.
Right.
And the Ku Klux Klan and the Chamber of Commerce win. They are able to motivate enough native-born workers and middle-class people to care about urban reform and to pass this corporate city government system.
Right.
And it's not a happy tale. Because the workers, the American Federation of Labor, at the AFL, the organized labor in Maine at the time, they were not interested in this campaign. They took no position.
Yeah.
And even a few months prior to this, in June of 1923, they had basically come out strongly in favor of immigration restriction, and against immigrants in general.
Right.
So the organized labor was not involved in stopping it.
Yeah.
So there was no leftists involved in this, and they weren't able to coalesce as a, it's Portland's small African American community, its NAACP, Irish communities, Jewish, etc. And the politicians, they couldn't stop it. They couldn't stop the Ku Klux Klan, basically, from helping them win this election.
And back then, it was often said that the Klan was the armed wing of the Democratic Party. Would that be fair to say?
Not at all in
Okay.
Maine. In Maine, the Ku Klux Klan was staunchly Republican.
Okay. Maine was a Republican state. Yeah.
So the Ku Klux Klan was really progressive in what that meant at that time period, was that it was not tied to one party or the other.
Okay.
This was a period where political parties were distrusted in general. There was a lot of people who didn't like political parties.
They are today, but it's not.
Yeah, we're in a very similar historical moment today. And the Ku Klux Klan was flexible.
Mhm.
So in Alabama, where there was no Republican Party, only Democrats, they would have been Democrats. In the Northeast, where the Democratic Party was mostly ethnic voters, mostly Irish, Jewish, Italian, those were a big portion of the Democrats in the North, working class immigrants.
True, different dynamic.
The Republicans were the party of the Ku Klux Klan in the North.
That would make sense. Right.
So yeah, they were very flexible. One of the leaders, actually, of the Ku Klux Klan, and one of the people who helped organize the Charter Amendment campaign as an employee of the Chamber of Commerce, he was described in a biography of him as a progressive.
Well, the term had a different meaning back then.
Yes, it did.
Did it have
Although
some connection with the progressive movement? Like, it wasn't radical, but it was like sort of rationalized, like a rational managerial structure. Like who the guy, what's his name, J. Edgar Hoover, started out as a quote progressive. I remember that.
Yep. Yeah, progressive, it was that you said it well, I think, about rationalization and professionalization.
Yeah, more middle class movement, cracking down on the working class, and also cracking down on what seems corrupt big city bosses. More middle class oriented movement, a kind of rational system.
Right. And that's actually how they sold the city manager system. Right. That a professional who knew how to run cities would be running city government.
Right.
And he would eliminate corruption. He would eliminate bosses, political bosses. He would, which didn't happen. It just put one boss in charge, which was the Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah.
And corruption was just as high thereafter. What the function of what eventually happened, so they inaugurate the city manager system, and what happens is the government basically, people stop voting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
no reason to. Yeah.
There's no reason to vote anymore, because it's even before it happens, the members of mostly the Irish and Jewish communities say, even a Jewish community leader, he says, there's no reason to vote. If this passes, every Irishman in the city might as well move, because you will not have any political voice anymore.
Right.
And that's what happens, basically. People stop turning out to vote. Portland, which had been a very heavily trade union dominated city at that time period, one of the trade union cities of leading cities in New England.
Okay.
By the time Franklin Roosevelt runs for office, the state of Maine never votes for Franklin Roosevelt. Not one of only two states. And I have plenty to say about FDR.
Yeah.
But he was much more pro-worker than the Republicans were. And Maine was one of two states that never did. The other was Vermont.
Vermont was the other one. Right.
And city government in Portland is basically focused on cutting taxes.
Hmm. Yeah.
So the city government reduces the tax rate, even during the Great Depression, when city governments all over the world, I think, at least all over the United States, they increased taxes to be able to help people who were out of work,
Right.
create public works programs on the city level. Portland didn't do that.
Right.
Portland basically just said, it's your problem, deal
Yeah.
with it. We're not going to raise taxes.
Right.
And there's a famous event in 1937, just to cap this off, when right after the United Auto Workers win big in Flint, Michigan, and in Detroit, and there's sort of a strike wave going on all over the country.
Right.
The chief of police and the city manager are given the go-ahead to shoot people who go on strike, who do sit-down strikes in Portland.
Right.
So this trade union city, which had been so, had seen this amazing workers movement in the 1900s, early, before World War One, is shut out from all the progressive gains during the New Deal, and has no real radical movement to speak of during this time period.
Right. There's a strike.
Right. And strikes are, if you think you're going to get shot, you're a lot less likely to go on strike.
Right. Right.
And the use of, state violence is successful. And on an ethnic level, there are no Jews or there are no Jewish people or Catholics elected to city government for over 30 years after this passes. So, that tells you a lot about the trajectory. And in some ways, I think a legacy of this is the Ku Klux Klan won.
Yeah.
People tend to think the Ku Klux Klan, it disappears in most of the country after 1928. But
There's scandal in Indiana or something.
yeah, there's scandals in Indiana after this that really make it look like a pretty disreputable organization, and it's unable to continue growing at the pace it had. But these men and women who joined the Ku Klux Klan didn't disappear. They didn't just die off all of a sudden.
Right. Right.
And my argument is that the city manager system is one of the legacies of the Ku Klux Klan in Maine.
Right. Interesting. Would you think it would be fair to say that to an extent Portland, Maine was a microcosm of what happened in the rest of the country around that period? Or was it a somewhat different?
No, I do. I chose Portland, one, because it's my home, or it's where I was born and raised, and where I'll always consider it my homeland. But I also chose it because despite being a relatively small city, it does represent many of the trends that happened during this time period.
Right.
And so I think Portland, as a city that, a lot of times when we look at urban histories, we look at cities like New York or Chicago or Los Angeles or San Francisco that were large and had very diverse populations,
Right.
Majority immigrant cities. But most of the United States was not like that.
Right.
Most cities looked more like Portland, where there was definitely a large immigrant population, but the majority of people were still of English descent, native-born English descent. So I think Portland also is useful to understand what was happening, not just in the very large cities of the country, but also in the smaller ones where, a huge percentage of people lived, and also where a lot of business went on, especially with exports to Europe. Portland was one of the largest ports in the country at this time period. So
Okay. That's interesting. Wow.
yeah, so that's my work that published online.
Okay. I'll provide a link for it. And I don't know if you can talk much about it. You're currently working on your PhD thesis, your doctorate.
Yep. I'm doing my doctorate in history at Concordia University here in Montreal.
Okay.
And I'm looking at transnational labor history in the U.S. and Canada,
Okay.
and transnational labor radicalism in
Okay.
particular.
Okay.
So, right now, and this is still a working idea,
Sure.
but I want to look at independent unions that
Mm.
didn't that opposed both the American Federation of Labor
Mm-hmm.
and the CIO, the
Right.
Congress of Industrial Organizations,
Right.
and who sort of had this independent path that opposed both sort of like Stalinist labor organizing, which
Mm-hmm.
was common in the 1930s and 40s,
Yeah.
which uh, accepted Jim Crow in some places or downplayed racial equality as a goal. Um, and also the conservatism of the craft-based American Federation of Labor,
Right.
and also in Canada, um, I want to look at the same thing, but maybe in a slightly later period, because a theme in Canadian history is the similar things happen in Canada, just a little bit later.
Right. Right. Okay.
So
That's
I want to
interesting.
look, yeah. So I'm gonna look at different labor radicals who refuse to sort of be part of the mainstream labor movement,
Right.
and sort of which became very conservative after 1945.
Yeah.
Much more conservative after Taft-Hartley kicked out the communist organizers,
Yep.
and look at that. But it's still a work in progress.
Okay. Have you read Teamsters Rebellion by Farrell Dobbs?
I haven't read that yet, but it's
It's a
on my list.
masterpiece. A
Yeah,
masterpiece. It's not, the Teamsters weren't really an independent union. They were started off as a craft union, but
yeah,
Farrell Dobbs was a Trotskyist group, which moved it towards mass union work. And it's an interesting book. Might
yeah. No, there's several. There's also the book by Brian Palmer about the strike in Minneapolis, I think.
right. I've read that one. Yeah, I forget the name. That's a masterpiece too.
Yeah,
That's even better in some ways. Yeah, it's a masterpiece.
yeah. No, I do think the story of Trotskyism is probably undertold. I'm not a Trotskyist myself, but like I do think that especially in the 30s and 40s, they had like a really influential role in the labor movement, in sectors of the labor movement. And I'm looking forward to reading about that.
Okay, cool. Okay, well, thank you for spending your time sharing this with me, with us. Is there
Yeah.
anything else you'd like to say, or?
Um, no, just thank you for having me on, and I look forward to watching more of your shows on YouTube.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it, Tom.
All
Thank
right.
you. Thanks a
See
lot.
you later.
See you
Bye.
later. Bye bye.